Welcome to our panel, The Coming Infrastructure Boom. Before we start the discussion today, we're going to open it with some introductory comments by Secretary of Transportation, Elaine Chao. For those of you that know Elaine, she has a long and distinguished career in transportation, both in the public sector as well as in the private sector, and also having formerly served as the Secretary of Labor in the Bush administration. She has been a longtime advocate for infrastructure, transportation in particular, and we welcome her today. We're honored to have her on the stage to open this session. Madam Secretary.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here, and I want to once again thank Mike Milken. I've watched his conferences over the years, and it is nothing short of impressive that he's able to gather such a wonderful group of people, of thought leaders, to discuss very, very important issues. So I want to thank Mike Milken once again for conceiving and implementing and establishing this wonderful institute. This morning we talked about infrastructure, and that's obviously something that I'm very concerned about. And then also, because I was Secretary of Labor, I also have many thoughts and concerns about the types of jobs that we have in the future. But let me talk about infrastructure first of all. Infrastructure is indeed the backbone of the economy, and it's so critical to maintaining our country's competitiveness. But as you know, our infrastructure is aging, and it's failing to keep pace with emerging technologies and the demand for greater capacity. We are fortunate to have a president who is a builder and who understands these challenges, which is why he has made infrastructure one of his top priorities. The administration's infrastructure proposal has been taking shape for months, and the package will be announced fairly shortly. To put it together, the administration launched a wide-ranging consultative process. It has involved 16 different federal agencies, numerous governors, mayors, state and local entities, and of course, the private sector as well. We've also been aided by an infrastructure task force that has great Americans on it who are experts in infrastructure as well. We feel that it's really important to have as much input as possible so that we can avoid the pitfalls that has led past proposals to fail. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I'm here today. The proposal will cover more than infrastructure, transportation infrastructure. It would also include energy, water, and potentially broadband and veterans hospitals as well. And the plan, as OMB Director Mick Mulvaney announced about a week ago, will include about $200 billion in direct federal funds that will be used to leverage $1 trillion in infrastructure investment over the next 10 years. But let's be clear, the federal government will not be in the handout business. And that's what one of the president's assistants said. A 2004 GAO study on highways found that the federal funding can suppress total infrastructure investment by replacing rather than augmenting state and local dollars. Currently, 16% of infrastructure spending is federal. The other 84% is state, local, and private investment. So in order to access new federal government investments, state and localities will be asked to come forward with projects that have secured some funding of their own. The federal money will be used as an incentive to get projects underway quickly. And another key component will be unleashing the billions in private capital available to invest in infrastructure by incentivizing public-private partnerships. We are not saying that the public-private partnerships will be the only recourse, but currently there are many municipalities, states, and other areas in which public-private partnerships are forbidden. What we are saying is there's great promise in public-private partnerships, and they should be allowed to be considered as one of the alternatives in infrastructure funding. Let me note also that regulatory reform will be a critical component to the president's plan as well, because the regulatory process is responsible for delays that add billions of dollars in extra costs to project delivery, not to even mention the delays in timing. So at the Transportation Department, I have assembled a task force that has already identified many legislative and regulatory changes that could streamline project approval. And streamlining the regulatory process not only cuts costs, but can improve environmental outcomes by delivering infrastructure improvements more quickly. Finally, let me add that the current thinking envisions an infrastructure bill with several components, and rural infrastructure is expected to be an important topic as well. We had talked about the kinds of jobs that would be available. Well, jobs that are involved with the infrastructure initiative will be good-paying jobs that would offer a great deal of Americans and residents good opportunities. My department is also in charge of regulating a lot of the emerging technologies that are coming forward. And of course, the job component of a lot of these new emerging technologies will be something that we will be addressing and that I look forward to discussing with you as well. So thank you so much for being here. We love to hear from you as well, and we've got a great panel of panelists who are experts in their field, and I hope that you'll join me in welcoming them as well. But I'm going to go and sit down, and I think the MC is going to come back. Thanks so much for being with us. Is it this one or? Okay.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Let me start off with some introductions of our panelists here. To my far right, Governor Terry McAuliffe of the Commonwealth of Virginia, the 72nd governor of the state of Virginia since 2014, chairman of the bipartisan National Governors Association. But what is most interesting to us is his focus on transportation. He has been a very strong advocate for transportation infrastructure. As we were talking on the way in here, he mentioned that he has $10 billion of transportation infrastructure currently under construction in Virginia. So we're going to hear a lot more about what Governor is doing to advance infrastructure in the state. To my left, Reed Cordish, Assistant to the President for Intragovernmental and Technology Initiatives. He's a real estate developer by background and also an advisor on the White House Office of American Innovation, overseeing projects to advance innovation and technology and infrastructure, and also taking a leadership role on the President's $1 trillion infrastructure plan, and we'll hear more about that as we continue here today. Then to Reed's left, Susan Gray, the Global Head of Infrastructure at S&P Global. She leads S&P's credit benchmarks, ratings, analytics, and infrastructure markets. She's an infrastructure banker and a lawyer and has a deep focus on energy and transportation investment and financing. And then André Bourbonnais at the end here, President and CEO of PSP Investments, one of Canada's largest pension investment managers with over $116 billion of assets under management, with a widely diversified global portfolio, but an increasing interest in infrastructure here in the United States and around the world. So thank you to all the participants for joining us here today. And last year at this time, I sat on this stage and I hosted a panel that addressed the growing gap between the need for infrastructure and the money to fund it amid a very rapid urbanization that we are seeing here in the U.S. and we're seeing in all the major cities of the world. And now we hear fast forward over the past 12 months, and what a difference a year makes. We see a very bright, intense, and wide spotlight focused on infrastructure today like we have never seen before. We're seeing that spotlight and interest at the public sector, and we're seeing it from the federal to the state to the local level. We're seeing it among the private sector. We're seeing it among our taxpayers. And so for the first time in decades, we have a real alignment here in a bipartisan way to address and tackle the incredibly complex infrastructure challenges that we have here in the U.S. And there's a real sense of urgency. Now, we've seen some real positive steps in the past 2 years. We saw the $305 billion transportation bill that was passed a little over a year ago. We have seen gas taxes raised in 30-plus states over the last 2 years. We're still waiting for that to happen at the federal level. We saw just in the November elections alone $200 billion of specific transportation tax measures at the municipal level, led most significantly by Measure M here in Los Angeles. And then 2 weeks ago, we saw the signing of the $54 billion transportation bill in the state of California. But amid all that progress, it still leads us to the trillion-dollar question. What is going to happen at the federal government level to bring all of this together, to coordinate with the state, local, with the public sector and the private sector? And what is the role of the private sector in this incredibly complex problem? And so we have assembled a panel today of experts from both the government and the private sector to look at project priorities, to look at funding approaches, alternative financing approaches, so that we can deliver some truly transformational outcomes and some transformational transportation projects. So I'd like to start with Secretary Chao. Thank you for your introductory comments. But when we look at the landscape of the challenges that we have in front of us, they are so wide and varied. We have a $3.5 trillion infrastructure gap here in the United States. We can't solve all of it overnight, and we can't solve all of it in the short term. So how will the federal government prioritize among all of the needs across the country in all the different sectors in the both rural and urban environment?
You know, the infrastructure of the country is very decentralized. So the federal government has a role, but the state and local entities have a role as well. So as I mentioned, 16% of all infrastructure funding investments comes from the federal government. 84% is in conjunction or at the initiation of the state and local governments. So we are a very decentralized system. The gasoline taxes of which we collect comes to the federal government, the Department of Transportation, and then we block grant it out to the states. So I'm delighted that Governor McAuliffe is here because he can talk about that as well. But basically, we work in a partnership with the state and the local entities to make sure that there is congruence of agreement on what the projects are. So the federal government does not set the priorities. We do that in conjunction with the states. And secondly, another aspect about the decentralization of the infrastructure that we have in this country is that we have a lot of public quasi-governmental authorities that also address the infrastructure on a regional basis. So there's the federal, the state, and also these quasi-private, quasi-public state and local entities that we all have to work with as well, which is why how the legislation is written is going to be very important because we want to leverage the funding that comes from the federal government, incentivize it so that when it goes to the state and local entities, that there is motivation there to encourage innovative and different types of financing mechanisms that heretofore have either not been tapped fully or disallowed. Mm-hmm. So we want to incentivize and leverage the $200 billion of federal funding. And I think given the talent in this room and many others that we have spoken with, that is a very attractive alternative to the private sector.
Great, thank you. So Governor McAuliffe, being such a proponent of infrastructure in the state of Virginia, these words must be music to your ears. But I have a two-part question for you. What assistance does the state need, your state or other states need from the federal government to advance infrastructure? And the second part of that question is, what role do you see public-private partnerships playing in solving the infrastructure gap in your state or other states?
Well, if you ask me what the states need, we lead the nation today on public-private partnerships. Virginia has done more than any state in America. In fact, the enabling legislation that most states use was drafted in Virginia. 30 states have P3 legislation. Only 10 have actually done a P3, and really 4 lead the nation: Virginia, Florida, Texas, and California. What would I need from the federal government? And the Secretary and I have had this conversation. I've also discussed it with Reid in the White House. Dedicated funding obviously is very important. I think we have a real opportunity with a new president in. We need to deal with the dedicated funding piece. We bring in about $45 billion from our gas tax, but we spend $55 billion, so we already have a $10 billion gap. We need to close that gap. We need some political courage in the Congress to come up and for once have a dedicated funding. Number 2, the fast lane grants that the DOT gives out, critical for the states to continue that. The TIFIA loan, which is absolutely instrumental. Last year I did a $1.9 billion TIFIA loan for my Silver Line Metro. I have 2 more applications in with the Secretary right now, which I know she'll look kindly on. But these TIFIA loans, these low interest loans, are the only way I can bring the private equity folks in. So they're absolutely critical. The Secretary and I have talked about permitting process takes entirely too long. You shouldn't have multiple agencies, Highway Authority, Army Corps working after one another. They should do it earlier. In the beginning would be something that, I would strongly recommend that we get going. But listen, Virginia, we lead on P3s. I just announced 66, which was the most congested road in America, $2.4 billion project. It's now, I said I would do it myself at the state, which was a good leverage point for us, and we determined how much it would cost Virginia. It cost us about $600 million to $1 billion. I then put it out to the private sector, and the private sector beat my bid, and not a cent of taxpayer money will now be used, and they're writing us a check for $500 million on close. I just announced the Atlantic Gateway project. Federal government gave me $165 million. I matched it with $700 million from the state, and the private equity is about $530 million. 18 miles of new express lanes, 20 miles of new railway, new bridges. It is a true partnership. Federal government has to continue to give us some dedicated funding. Then we will take that and take it out to the private market. The issue is for those really 40 states that don't do P3s. A lot of them, Montana has no capacity. They don't have any toll roads. Nevada, they have no capacity. So dedicated funding for states where still transportation is critical is absolutely, I would say, the top issue. And I'm hoping, and I told the folks at the White House yesterday, we will stand with you as governors if we're going to announce a dedicated funding and say we stand to get this dedicated funding. It's probably the most important. This is a real turning point for our country. We need $4 to $6 trillion immediately to deal with the issues. There's $1 trillion here. It's a good start. But if you look at our massive needs in America, we're 10, 12, 13 trillion dollars. Sewage facility. We dump hundreds of thousands of tons of raw sewage into the Potomac River from Alexandria, Virginia when it rains. We got to fix that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no question that we've got to find new ways to fix this problem. And you look at the amount of monies that are spent here in the U.S. We spend about 2.4% of our GDP on infrastructure. Currently in Europe, most countries are spending about 5% of their GDP. China at the peak was spending 9% of their GDP on infrastructure. So we have a significant catch-up to undertake here. But we are not going to solve it just with the current way of doing business. We're going to have to couple it with not only more private sector money, but also innovation. And I'd like to move to you, Reid, as your role. It's an interesting role, both in the Office of Innovation at the White House, as well as being on point with the infrastructure plan. How do we start thinking about innovation as a way to solve this problem when we're trying to solve today for some of the problems using old technology, whether it be old rail or surface transportation, in the world of autonomous cars and Hyperloop and SpaceX Boring Company and other new technologies? How do we marry all that together to maybe come at this from a different angle to close this gap more efficiently and more rapidly?
It's an easy answer to a very complex question. The easy answer is by leveraging the private sector. Mm-hmm. If we're going to have the most innovative, most forward-thinking solutions to our infrastructure problems, we have to work with the very best minds. Now, the great thing for us is those great minds are right here in the U.S. You don't have to look past Silicon Valley. You don't have to look farther than down the road with what Elon Musk is doing to see the right solutions from an innovation standpoint for these problems. Now, I very much agree with what the governor said, that we have a multi-trillion-dollar problem that we have to solve because we are in a globally competitive environment. We have to fix a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure issue to stay globally the leader that we need to be. To do that, we have to think far beyond the projects that we're going to create through this infrastructure package. We have to fix a fundamentally broken process. And we've alluded to it in the remarks by Secretary Chao, that right now it's a 10-year plus process when it needs to be a 2-year or less process. And countries like Australia and Canada have shown us and have led the way that you can protect your environment and you can have a permit process that makes sense and takes out the uncertainty and allows the private sector to come in. If we do that, if we have a process that makes sense, then we can focus on bringing in the great innovators and great thought leaders from the private sector to make sure we're solving the infrastructure issues of tomorrow, not solving the problems of 15 years ago. And we'll do that by leveraging those minds and those abilities.
Well, certainly it's music to my ears to hear this aim to reduce the permitting process from 10 years to 2 years, because we all, for our entire careers, have wrestled with this incredible, difficult permitting process that slows the implementation of infrastructure. And we'll touch on this a little bit later when we talk about the private sector and how difficult it is to attract the private sector on investment because of this lengthy process. So we're anxiously awaiting the movement at the White House to reduce some of this regulatory burden. But before we move to the private sector, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this growing debate between where we prioritize our infrastructure investments between the rural and the urban environment. We have dramatic needs both at the rural and the urban level. How do you balance that, and how do you think the White House ought to be balancing that to ensure that we get true bipartisan support?
It's a great question, and this can't be an infrastructure package just for high-density urban areas. It can't be an infrastructure package just for the coasts. It has to be an infrastructure package for all of America, and that's critical. The heartland of this country and the Midwest and the Sun Belt are responsible for a tremendous amount of our GDP growth, and they're vital for our long-term prosperity. And you're right, they require different solutions. In high-dense areas, it's much easier to create user fees that can propel public-private partnerships by giving the revenue centers that they need. It's more difficult in rural areas. Two things I'd say. One, that is where, as Secretary Chao alluded to, said, the $200 billion of federal funding can play a very important role. It can allow for projects that wouldn't otherwise happen in the free market to take place. And whether that's rural broadband or whether that's any number of projects that are important for the whole country to continue to prosper, but wouldn't take place or won't happen just from the private sector alone, that's a great opportunity for the government to play a vital role. I think that's what I would most point to. We have a finite amount of dollars. We need to choose them very carefully. I think in the urban centers, it's by incentivizing local municipalities to create revenue streams to allow the private sector to come in and do what they do best. And I think in the rural areas, it's about the government playing a role to make sure through our initiatives and through our money that projects take place that otherwise might not.
Great. So, Susan, I'd like to hear your thoughts and a segue from the comment about the rural environment. And I know you and I have spoken about the bundling concept to allow us to attract private sector money for rural environments. So I'd like to hear about that, but I'd also like to hear your thoughts, and you're involved in rating credit risk and helping investors understand the risk they're taking on. And one of the challenges that we've had in bringing private investment into the public sector has been the risk transferring, and whether it's the revenue center issue that Reed mentions or understanding the risk of the development process. How should we be thinking about a new way of thinking about risk transfer to encourage more private investment, and how should we be thinking about this rural bundling issue that Reed touched on?
Sure, thanks, Mike, and it's great to be here talking about infrastructure as such an important issue. I think the first thing to note is that PPPs are generally the mechanism through which the the risk is transferred from the public sector to the private sector. And when we talk about risk here, we're talking about construction risk, delivering on time and on budget. We're talking about operating risk in a world where the tastes and needs of consumers, as we know, are rapidly changing because of disruption and technological change. And we're talking about maintenance risk. And the way a PPP is generally structured is that the asset at the end of the 30 or 40 or 25-year concession reverts back to the public sector as owner of the asset. So maintaining that asset becomes an intrinsic part of the whole discussion and negotiation that goes on between the public and private sector. And so what we're talking about really here is transferring real risk, and we're also talking about a structure which enables the private sector, as they bid in to a project, and Governor McAuliffe was talking about this earlier, to actually think about what are the better ways in which the private sector can deliver the project. It may be an operational improvement, it may be a construction and design improvement, it may be thinking forward about how this asset is going to be used over 20 or 30 years and just building that into the approach that's taken. So when we at S&P look at the credit rating of an infrastructure project, and we've looked at thousands of infrastructure projects over the 25 years since infrastructure has become a privately financed asset class, there are a few things that really stand out. I mean, the first is that the project has, generally is more robust if it meets a real need, and that need is supported by government and understood by the community, effectively communicated to the community. Secondly, the risks are allocated appropriately, and the financial structure is such that it allows the project to deal with downturns in the economy or different uses. And thirdly, that the long-term operation of the project and those costs are properly taken into account. And this really gets me to the question about bundling that you asked earlier, which is that we do have a situation today where, because we haven't necessarily taken the life cycle cost of projects and infrastructure into account, we have a lot of deferred maintenance sitting around in communities, in cities, in states on their books. And one example of the way that the state of Pennsylvania looked at that recently was that they took 500 structurally deficient bridges, bundled them together into a single transaction, were able as a result to attract more interest from the private sector, from contractors, operators in financing it, and rebuilding it, and they were able to also lock in a long-term maintenance contract. And I think that sort of model is something that we're seeing in the water sector. We're seeing it in arterial roads in Australia. It's something that is being used in broadband, and it's also something which can bring states together to collectively come up with solutions to their infrastructure issues.
Right. Thank you. So I'd like to move to André. We talk a lot about the private sector getting more involved in investing in these assets, but André, you're the guy that writes the checks. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on how do you prioritize with so many opportunities in different sectors. How do you prioritize the type of projects that are of interest to you, the things that make a project more or less attractive when you're considering actually writing a check?
Yeah, well, I think that the first thing I'd say, I think I'm representative of a number of institutional international investors that are, for which infrastructure are really an important asset class, but are underinvested in the U.S. And there's nothing we'd like more than to be able to participate in this. Now, as far as PSP is concerned, we have about 12 billion Canadian of asset in our infrastructure group. And the priorities are really determined by three main factors. So first is our mandate. Our mandate is simple in its form, a little bit more complicated in execution, but it's to maximize return without undue risk of loss. So we don't have an economic development component to our mandate, so therefore the right adjusted risk return project are really important for us. And that's why we've focused mostly on brownfield as opposed to greenfield. The other element is the skill set that we have. We're financial investors, and that's what our people are. We're not developer of projects, so therefore, again, it steers us toward more of the brownfield. And in jurisdiction where there's a good transparency in the process, there's good transparency in the regulatory environment, and finally, good historical view on income stream and cash flows. And the last thing I'd say is scalability. We're not a super large fund, but 12 billion is not an insignificant amount of money. And that search for scalability has really made us focus on project other than what I would call social infrastructure, so the hospital and the like, and the PPPs, which are often for that type of project. So that's how we establish priorities. So we're core infrastructure in jurisdiction like Australia and the UK, which are very favorable for ownership of infrastructure assets to institutional investors.
Thank you, Andre. So, Governor McAuliffe, coming back to you, you mentioned your strong support for P3, and you've had great success with P3s in your state. What's getting in the way now of utilizing the P3 structure even more so in Virginia that you'd like to address?
Well, as I say, we lead the nation on P3s. We've got, I think, great enabling legislation in Virginia. The other smart thing we did last year, and let me be very clear too, P3s aren't the be-all and end-all. When I became governor, I inherited two very bad projects. One was Route 460 from our port through the southern part of Virginia. The state had spent $300 million on a road. They had never applied for a permit. Now, in order to permit over 400 acres of wetlands, which, has never been done in U.S. history, but maybe the Army Corps was going to permit Virginia's, we never even applied for the permit. Not a shovel had gone in the ground. I canceled that. First thing I did, first month in office. The Midtown Tunnel deal, gigantic, where the largest naval base in the world is. The tolls were so high, it was crippling to the communities that people couldn't get to work anywhere. I canceled those. So I'd say, first of all, on P3s, they got to be done right. But I never blame the companies. I always say, if the lawyers for the companies out negotiate the state, that's our fault. I've never gone and blamed the companies. So we in Virginia now have transformed our whole P3 process. We now have good lawyers to help us negotiate the deals. I want the private companies to make money, otherwise this doesn't make any sense. And we now have legislation in Virginia. No road can be built in Virginia unless it goes through what we call smart scale. 15 different metrics. There are no political roads in Virginia. As governor, I could tell my Secretary of Transportation I want a road here, he'd say, good luck. Doesn't matter. It has to go through. I give my legislatures a binder of every project. This year we had 800 projects we're bid on. We'll end up putting 130 out. Everyone gets scored. So the issue for P3 is you got to make sure you structure them right. But in Virginia, I couldn't build these roads. I have 55 miles of express lanes in northern Virginia. For those that live in the Maryland, D.C., Virginia area, you are now going to be able to move seamlessly through express lanes. The only way I could have done that is through P3s. Mm-hmm. Only way. There's no way the state could have afforded to do it. It's obviously not with the federal government, but working with the federal government to give us seed money and then for us to put in our money, but then to allow these low interest loans from TIFIA. I brought in so much private. I had 2 gigantic bidders on the last project I did. That's how it works. Mm-hmm. I think it's the only way you can go forward. And Reed and I met, as I say, last night, talked about what the White House wants to propose. This is the way you're going to do it, is a panacea in order to build new roads, also for your electrical grid, also for, as I say, sewage treatment facilities. But there has to be some component of income, and you have to be willing as a governor to deal with the user fees. Last thing I'll say, we did raise our gas tax. We're one of the 30 states. A lot of this is talk in my personal opinion, and I'll speak on behalf of the governors if we don't have increased funding from the federal government. The federal government, we have not raised the gas tax in 20 years. It has half the purchasing power it had back in the 90s. I hate to say it, it's the third rail. Federal government has to bite the bullet and do the right thing. We'll stand with the federal government. We got to raise the federal gas tax because right now it's unsustainable where we are today.
So I think you correctly point out that P3s are not the be-all and end-all, and I'd like to hear from Secretary Chao and Reed about what else we might see in an infrastructure plan. You know, we have seen the plank in the campaign platform around the Wilbur Ross, Peter Navarro plan that involved infrastructure credits to facilitate private sector money, but that's still only one arrow in the quiver. We've heard talk about a possible combination with international tax reform using the repatriation of untaxed foreign profits to fund infrastructure. We've heard about an infrastructure bank. What is the art of the possible in Washington right now, given the political dynamics?
Well, first of all, there was a sequence, you know, people in Washington actually do have some rationality. I know that that's kind of sometimes unpopular to say, but there was actually a legislative calendar. And the most important thing in the legislative calendar is time. So there's a sequence to all of this. So it was supposed to start with the Affordable Health Care Act, and then tax reform and infrastructure. And there's a reason for that sequence, because each will throw off additional funding. So there was the thought of one of the byproducts of the tax reform would be a dedicated funding, as the governor had mentioned, for infrastructure, of perhaps repatriation of profits overseas, and that would be part of the comprehensive tax reform. So if you look at the $1 trillion, and I want Reed to kind of pipe in as well, you're talking about direct federal funding, you're talking about some element of the tax reform bill, and then the remainder, well, then you can have sale of government assets, so that's also another possibility, and then you can have public-private partnerships. But what we have found is that what you want most is the multiplier effect. What can be of most value is not the direct funding, but is how do we leverage the direct funding? It's like seed capital. You know, how do we leverage the seed capital so that there's incredible velocity and multiplier effect and leveraging of the dollars? Because as we mentioned, it's $1 trillion over 10 years. The needs are greater than that. But again, there are all sorts of consequences that are associated with direct federal funding, and we've not even addressed those, but it's crowding out of the private sector, it's adding to our deficit. So all of these issues are considered in conjunction with the forward movement. So, you know, right there are 4 revenue streams already. There are actually 16 or 17, and every single one of them has some detractors and deterrence. And so we have to discuss all of that, and there will be leadership from this administration, from this president, but we have to go ahead, and when we take on one of these pay-fors that are not extraordinary, that are not popular, we need to understand how to handle it, how to have a strategy to deal with the opposition, and how to go forward. I think that's responsible governing.
Well, we agree that public-private partnerships are not the only aspect that's going to fix the nation's infrastructure. I really want to echo what Secretary Chao has said. The president has challenged us to look at the infrastructure package in a holistic manner. And that's really how we're approaching it. That's why it is such a large, involved bill at the end of the day. We're going to fix the broken permit process, and as we've said, go from 10 years to 2 years. We're going to create revenue streams to allow for the trillions of dollars of capital that wants to invest in U.S. infrastructure to be able to have an avenue to. Right now, they're blocked out, and that has to be remedied and has to be fixed. At the same time, while we rebuild America through this package, we're also going to use this as an opportunity to retrain America. America has to be ready for these jobs of tomorrow, and we need to make sure that we have a vocational, skill-based initiative done through the states and tied to the private sector so that Americans are ready to take on these hundreds of thousands and millions of jobs that we will be creating through the infrastructure package and through the president's commitment to return manufacturing to the United States particularly manufacturing sectors that aren't currently represented. So when we think about infrastructure, we're thinking about the complete package, a permit fix, creating revenue streams for the private sector, rebuilding and retraining America, and setting America up for the next 50 years and beyond.
Rita, you talking about putting that in the infrastructure to have the workforce development within it as part of it?
Yes.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, so actually Ivanka's very interested in that.
Ivanka's
working
been
on
a
it.
terrific leader
Yes.
for it. The president believes in it. He believes a skill and a trade should be honored, and it's something that we need to commit to. So if we're going to rebuild America and we're going to create the jobs, then we need to invest in the American worker, make sure that they're ready for these jobs.
I think that's well said, Reed. Now, I think when we start to play out this P3 initiative and the private sector funding, it is not the panacea. It is not the only solution. But when we compare and contrast it to other countries, here in the United States, 1% of our infrastructure is funded through the P3 model. If you look at other advanced countries across Europe, Canada, Australia, it's 10%. So just taking that 1% and moving it to 10%, again, it's one arrow in the quiver, but I think it has to be a part of the overall plan. But we haven't talked as much about infrastructure banks, and I'd like to hear André and Susan comment on whether an infrastructure bank model will work. Certainly in Canada, Prime Minister Trudeau has implemented a $35 billion infrastructure bank that I believe is being very well received across Canada. But André and/or Susan, I'd be interested in your comments on that.
Yeah, I was a bit puzzled when I was asked to talk about a Canadian infrastructure bank because it's still really at an early stage, quite frankly. And so, infrastructure was clearly an important aspect of the Trudeau government. They campaigned on it, they got elected on it. And then the infrastructure bank came out of an advisory board to Minister Morneau, our Minister of Finance, led by Dominic Barton, as a concept to channel more money to infrastructure in Canada. Now, I think the political horses got significantly in front of the cart, and depending on who you talk to, we're not quite sure what the mandate of the bank, and maybe I'll know more. I've got a call with Jim Leach, who's the former CEO of Ontario Teachers, who's the advisor of the government. So I've got a call with him tomorrow morning. But at one end of the spectrum, it seems that some people would like it to act sort of an export development agency and providing guarantee. At the other end of the spectrum, a full-fledged bank that's going to promote, develop project, that is going to raise foreign capital. So we're not quite sure what the bank is going to do, but let's assume it's more at the full-service bank spectrum. I think that what needs to happen, and I think the success of the Canadian pension plan is probably evidence of that, is it needs to operate significantly independently from the government. The government needs to have a role to supervise the bank, but certainly the board needs to be independent, needs to be an independent management. You cannot have direction from the government as to where the bank should invest the money. And like I said, I think we're still at the very early stage for that. I think we'll know more when the legislation passes in the fall, and after Jim provides his report. But certainly I feel uneasy really to say what the bank is going to do because the mandate has not been clearly defined, and that's, if there's one advice to people that are considering that structure, define the mandate first, and then the governance around it will take care of itself.
Susan?
I think it's not necessarily clear in the US what an infrastructure bank would do either, but I think that this is such a broad-ranging problem that you do need to have multiple solutions. And one of the advantages that we have in the US is we have a very deep capital market. And we have actually seen a lot of investment go into that market, both debt and equity, to finance the expansion of the energy sector over the last few years. So there are models whether they be master limited partnerships in the real estate sector. We've had REITs, the Build America bonds model in the tax-exempt sector was successful. So there are a number of ways in which a national approach could be taken to look at what has been successful in the past and where can it be broadened to move into for example, the transport infrastructure side, which has had more, from a PPP perspective, had more limited movement. I think the other area is development capital. So pre-financial close development capital is an area where where there's capacity to look at stimulating more innovation and more development. And then finally, the other area that has been quite popular in other markets is the concept of asset recycling, which is the flip to PPPs, where you actually have a government saying, we don't need to continue to own this operating asset. We can concession it, and we can take the proceeds from concessioning it and put it into high priority infrastructure that doesn't have a revenue stream attached to it.
Okay.
Mike, if I may add something, I think that, to come back to a point that Susan made, I think one of the role of the infrastructure bank needs to de-risk the project. And now, even though I said that pension plan or pension fund managers like ours are better owner than developer, at some point we'll have to get into this greenfield space, simply because right now I think the risk return on the brownfield is completely out of whack and risk is underestimated. So we'll need to get there. But the moment of transfer of that risk from let's call it the public sector to the private sector, and the determination of that moment is going to be absolutely key in the success of the bank.
Yeah, thank you. So,
At the Department of Transportation, we already have an infrastructure bank. In fact, many of the departments have something like an infrastructure bank, but it's not called the infrastructure bank. So the TIFIA loans and the RIF loans that the governor was mentioning comes out of the Department of Transportation, and it's an infrastructure bank. So the larger issue is, should these lending credit institutions within the various departments be somehow knit together? Because I think the problem, is that people don't know they exist. So they don't know how to access a lot of these programs. The second thing I would say about an infrastructure bank also is that I don't think that there is actually, I don't know about this audience, I'm interested to hear that there is actually uniformity on that issue. There are some who feel that the infrastructure bank doesn't necessarily get the best credits, and that it's those less, I don't know, I don't want to repeat things, but so I think there's a real debate about infrastructure banks, which is also occurring in the Senate and the House as well, which of course would impact the viability of such a proposal going forward.
Yep. So I think to move in a slightly different direction, I'd be interested in the point of view from the administration on the types of projects that are going to be of most interest. And I remember back to the 2009 timeframe, after the last big infrastructure bill, the buzzword was shovel-ready. And everyone was focused on shovel-ready projects to put people to work as quickly as possible. And I think when you look back in hindsight at that effort, it put some people to work very quickly, but what it didn't do was cause us to invest in the right long-term transformational projects that have the biggest impact on our economy over the long term. And so I'm now starting to hear the shovel-ready buzzword coming
Not
up.
out of me.
Okay. So I'd be interested in how you're going to balance that, because there are going to be legislators that are going to want to see shovel-ready.
So what we are going to emphasize, and what the president is emphasizing, is a fast-track permit process. It's different than shovel-ready, but it's that you're going to move unbelievably efficiently if the federal government is going to play a role in helping your project become a reality. So whether you're the private sector, whether you're a municipality, or challenging our own agencies, it's for an expeditious process that makes sense. There'll be some projects that move very quickly, that are quote shovel ready. There'll be other projects that take longer to effectuate, but all of them will move in the most efficient manner process. We're going to fix that process. There'll be some projects that actually take a real length of time to create. But the president has been clear that he wants us not only to create projects that are immediate, although those are very important, but also to think about projects that are transformational, to challenge us to think outside the box, projects that can lift American spirits and unleash massive GDP growth. So we're going to be attacking this from all aspects.
And I also think we need to focus, as the governor has said, dedicated funding is really important. There has to be a trust on the part of the American people that when they make a financial sacrifice, whether it be a tax or a user fee or whatever, that money's going to be used for transportation.
Right.
And in the past, there's not, that covenant has been broken. So we need to reinstate that trust that whatever they, whatever we dedicate to transportation is going to go to transportation.
So we haven't talked as much about air traffic.
Yes.
I'd be interested in the thoughts on the air traffic system and whether a potential privatization of the air traffic control system is even in the cards.
Well, it's not really privatization. What has prompted this, obviously this, I'm going to, should I do this?
Please.
What has prompted this is, I think, a great frustration with the congestion and delays which have plagued our skies. And it goes back to the basic governance structure of, can an entity that is both an operating entity operate the air traffic control and also regulate its safety. Most of the time in other countries, and also in different modes of transportation within the Department of Transportation, the safety regulatory aspect is separated out from the operational aspect. Secondly, I said at the initial outset that it's not really privatization because what is envisioned is a co-op-like, nonprofit organization that will assume the responsibility for air traffic control, but the regulatory, the safety aspect of it will still reside with the government. Hopefully with the entity out of the government, the part that controls the air traffic control, they will be freed from many of the shackles and the impediments of fast action. I was Deputy Secretary of Transportation in 1989. I'm telling you how old I am. Oh. I come back 27 years later, and I'm hearing the same arguments on air traffic control. We are going to bring air traffic control into the 21st century. It is currently a radar system. We are going to move it to GPS. So 1 minute remaining.
It will make us competitive globally. It has the support of business and it has the support of labor. And it's an imperative that we accomplish it.
Well, so I think that brings us to a close here. I want to thank all of our panelists for your thoughtful and insightful comments here today. And thank you once again.
Thank you.